They say every murderer makes one fatal mistake. Tonight, in The Silent Witness at Table 7, a Hercule Poirot mystery, we shall discover what that mistake was. I am Arthur Hastings, and this is The Little Grey Cells. First-time listeners, do make yourself known. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of the world is listening tonight. Tonight, Poirot is summoned to a tidal island, a house sealed by storms, and a dinner table laid for 7, when only 6 sit down. The legend calls it the Silent Witness. Poirot calls it something else entirely. So pour your tisane, settle in, and engage those little grey cells. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The Place That Remembers. I do not understand, said Hercule Poirot, regarding the letter in his hand with an expression of mild but genuine displeasure. Why any person of consequence should choose to live upon an island. His valet, George, who was laying out Poirot's evening clothes with the precise movements of a man who understood that precision was itself a form of respect, offered no reply to this observation. He had long since learned that certain of his employer's remarks were not questions. Poirot set the letter down on his desk, repositioning it twice until it lay exactly parallel to the blotter's edge, and regarded it as one might regard an unwelcome invitation to a damp country walk, which was, in point of fact, and very nearly what it was. The letter was from a Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe, and it had arrived 3 days earlier, written in a fine, controlled hand that nevertheless betrayed here and there the faint tremor of some sustained anxiety. Mrs. Ashcombe was the present owner of Greyhaven House, situated upon a tidal island off the Dorset coast. She wished Poirot to come at once. There was, she wrote, a matter of some uneasiness regarding family history. A phrase which Poirot had read 4 times, and found, each time, more artfully uninformative than the last. He had, after deliberation, accepted. It was not the vagueness that decided him. It was the handwriting. A woman who wrote with such control, yet whose pen had hesitated, almost imperceptibly, before the word history, was a woman who knew precisely what she feared and had chosen, with great care, not to say it. That, what Poirot reflected, was always interesting. The crossing to Greyhaven was made at dusk, and Poirot disliked every moment of it. The causeway was a narrow tongue of stone laid barely above the water, slick with weed and broken shells, extending from the mainland shore to the island with the unpromising character of a path that had never quite made up its mind to exist. A local man drove him in a cart. There was no other conveyance, and said nothing for the entirety of the journey except, at its conclusion, "Mind your step," which Poirot considered to be rather less helpful than a remark offered after the fact had any right to be. He arrived with damp shoes. This did not improve his view of the enterprise. Greyhaven House itself rose at the island's centre, if so modest an elevation deserved the word, as a low, wide mass of grey stone that seemed less to have been built than to have settled there, slowly, over centuries of argument with the wind. Yet the present structure was Georgian in its formal bones, its windows proportioned with a restraint that would have satisfied the most exacting architect. But beneath it, one sensed something older and less yielding, foundations of a different stone altogether, darker and thicker, that gave the lower walls a quality of having been here always. The entrance hall smelled of salt, old paper and extinguished fires. Mrs. Lydia Ashcombe received him in the drawing-room. She was a woman of perhaps 55, pale in the way of people who have lived long beside cold water, with grey eyes that were steady and a mouth that was composed with visible effort. She wore black, not mourning black, but the black of a woman who had found simplicity a reliable defence against the world's scrutiny. Her handshake was brief and firm. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you are very good to come." "It is my pleasure, madame." Poirot looked about the room with the mild, appreciative expression he habitually employed in the first minutes of an engagement, when one wished to observe without appearing to do so. A large fireplace, good solid furniture, a portrait above the mantel, late 18th century, of a woman in pale muslin who bore a faint resemblance to Mrs. Ashcombe herself. Several chairs arranged near the windows which looked out upon nothing but grey water and grey sky. And upon the sideboard, in the silver candlestick polished to a very high shine indeed, he noted that there were 7 candlesticks in a row. He noted too that Mrs. Ashcombe's gaze did not follow his to the sideboard. She knew he had seen them, he thought, and she had chosen not to remark upon it. That was also interesting. "The others have arrived," she said, "and are dressing for dinner. I hope you will forgive the informality of my note. I found it difficult to be precise in writing." "I found your note, madame, entirely precise in the matters that signify." He smiled gently. "You were afraid and you wished me here. Both things were clear." Something shifted briefly in her composed face. Then it was still again. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in a dining room that ran the length of the house's south wing, lit by lamps whose light pooled warmly on the silver and linen and did not quite reach the ceiling. The wind, which had been building since Poirot's arrival, moved through the building's seams and produced low, wandering notes, almost vocal, almost deliberate, that one noticed most during silences. Poirot noticed them continuously. The company was small. Besides Mrs. Ashcombe, there were 5 others. Dr. Marcus Linton sat at Mrs. Ashcombe's right, a large, vigorous man of 40, with the red complexion of someone who walked outdoors in all weathers, and considered this a moral virtue. He spoke loudly and often, and had already, in the interval before dinner, described the house as splendidly atmospheric, if you like that sort of thing, and the legend attached to it, of which Poirot had been told the barest outline, as the most transparent variety of rustic superstition. He said this with a laugh, and the laugh carried in it the faint strain of a man who is quite certain he is right, and finds it mildly irritating that others are not. Miss Clara Tregoran sat opposite. She was a thin, fair woman in her 30s, on a distant cousin of Mrs. Ashcombe's, and she had the quality of a person who listens more than she speaks. Not from reserve, Poirot thought, but from the habit of a mind that was always, quietly, frightened. Her hands resting beside her plate were never entirely still. Mr. Hugh Ashcombe, the nephew, was perhaps 30, dark-haired, and possessed of a calm that sat on him with the faint quality of an effort. He was polite to everyone and sat with his back straight and his expression measured, the look of a man who had decided, early in life, that composure was worth the cost. Mrs. Eleanor Pike completed the party on Poirot's immediate left. She was a comfortable woman of indeterminate middle age, with an open, pleasant face and the manner of someone who has never in her life said anything to cause offence. She was, Mrs. Ashcombe had explained, her companion of 10 years. She listened with great attentiveness when others spoke, and when she herself spoke, it was with a gentle encouragement, as though she were tending something. And then there was Thomas Grigg, who did not sit at table but moved about its periphery, removing plates and replacing them with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had performed these same actions for decades. He was old, considerably older than any other servant in the house, and when he was not actively engaged in his duties, he stood very still, with the distant and inward expression of a man remembering something unpleasant. The 7th place was laid. Poirot had observed it at once. The full setting, precisely arranged, at the foot of the long table. Silver aligned, crystal present, napkin folded, everything prepared for a guest who did not appear and in whose honour it seemed no explanation was to be offered. He waited until the soup had been served. Then, pleasantly, "Your party is 6, I believe, Mrs. Ashcombe, and yet the table is laid for 7. A silence fell that was of a different quality from the silences produced by the wind. Miss Tregoran's hands tightened on her spoon. Dr. Linton gave a short, sharp laugh. "Ah, you've noticed table 7, or rather the 7th place. It's always laid here, Poirot, part of the household's charming peculiarities." He waved a hand. "An old custom, connected to one of those local ghost stories that die out everywhere, except in the places where they're most inconvenient." "Marcus." Mrs. Ashcombe's voice was quiet. "Forgive me, Lydia, but really—" "It is the custom of the house," Mrs. Ashcombe said, addressing Poirot with the careful neutrality of a woman repeating a thing she has repeated many times before. "The 7th place is always set. It has been set here for as long as anyone has recorded. I do not claim belief in the legend associated with it, but I have never seen fit to discontinue the practice." "And the legend?" Poirot inquired, his voice entirely mild. It was Mrs. Pike who answered in her gentle, tending way. "There was a death here long ago, a disputed inheritance, they say. 7 sat at table that night. 1 died before morning, and a servant girl swore that she had seen, at the 7th chair, someone she had not seen enter." She paused, someone still, and hands folded, watching. It is said that when death comes again to Greyhaven, the witness returns to the 7th place. "Theatrical rubbish," said Dr. Linton, and ate his soup. Poirot said nothing. He was looking at the empty chair. He was thinking about the precise, particular way in which Mrs. Eleanor Pike had told that story. Not with fear, not with scepticism, but with the smooth, even pleasure of a woman who has told it before and found that it lands exactly where she intends. He did not sleep well that first night. The room given to him was large and cold and smelled of damp plaster and old wool. The sheets were faintly chill. The window admitted the sound of the sea, the slow, metronomic impact of water against stone, patient and indifferent. He lay in darkness and engaged in the small, private discipline of reminding himself that the dampness was a structural condition, that the sounds were meteorological, and that the sheets would be dry by morning if he positioned the warming pan correctly. He was nearly asleep when he heard it, a sound from the corridor, or below it, or within the walls, something moving across a wooden floor. Deliberate. One long, slow drag of something solid, and then stillness. Poirot lay without moving. After a moment he rose, lit a candle, opened his door, and examined the corridor in both directions. There was nothing. no servant, no open door, or no disturbance of any kind. The candle flame was perfectly steady. He returned to his room and stood for a moment in the centre of it, the candle in his hand, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly. "Wood," he said quietly, to no one. Old wood contracts in cold conditions. The floors move. It is entirely without significance. He replaced the candle, returned to bed, and arranged the blankets with methodical precision. He did not, for quite some time, close his eyes. Chapter 2. The Storm Arrives. Morning at Greyhaven arrived not with light, but with a gradual lessening of dark, a reluctant watercolour grey that seeped through the curtains and illuminated the room in a way that made everything in it look faintly provisional, as though the house itself had not yet decided whether to continue. Poirot rose early, as was his habit, and dressed with the care that he considered not vanity but respect. Respect for oneself, for the day, for the possibility that one might at any moment be required to think clearly, and it was easier to think clearly when one's appearance was beyond reproach. He arranged his moustaches in the glass, adjusted his collar, and regarded the result with the measured satisfaction of a craftsman inspecting completed work. Then he went to find the house. This was, in his experience, always necessary. One did not understand a household from the evidence of a single evening's dinner, and one understood it from the way it behaved when it believed itself unobserved, from the arrangement of objects set down without ceremony, from the conversations begun and abandoned in corridors, from the quality of the silences that collected in certain rooms and not others. Greyhaven had silences of exceptional quality. The ground floor was a geography of closed doors and uneven flagstones, of windows that looked out upon a sea, now the colour of pewter under a pewter sky. In the dining room he passed without entering, pausing only to observe, through its half-open door, that the table had already been reset from the previous evening. 7 places, laid with the same precision as before, the napkins folded identically, the silver aligned. He stood for a moment in the doorway. The 7th chair stood at the table's foot, at a slight remove from the others, as though it had been placed to observe rather than to participate. He noted the distance. He noted the angle. He noted, with a particular quality of attention he reserved for details that other people had stopped seeing, that the chair's legs had left faint impressions in the carpet. Shallow, but consistent with long use in exactly that position. The 7th place had not been moved in some considerable time. He filed the observation and continued down the passage. He found Thomas Grigg in the kitchen garden, or rather at its edge, standing with his arms at his sides and looking out at the water with the concentrated stillness of a man engaged in private worry. He was older than Poirot had initially judged, closer to 70 than 60, with the weathered, reddened face of someone who had spent the greater part of a lifetime in sea air. He registered Poirot's approach without surprise. "You are an early riser, Mr. Grigg," Poirot observed pleasantly. "Always have been." Grigg did not turn from the water. "Storm coming, and you can smell it." Poirot could not, in fact, smell it, though he could see that the sea had taken on a particular opacity, dense and flat and somehow purposeful, that he associated dimly with meteorological intent. "You have been at Greyhaven a long time," he said. 43 years. Now Grigg did turn, and his eyes, which were pale and direct, rested on Poirot with the appraising steadiness of a man who had outlasted several varieties of curious visitor. "Since before Mrs. or Ashcombe's time, since her husband's father. Then you will remember a great deal of the house's history." "I remember what's useful." A pause. "And some that isn't." Poirot smiled. It was the smile he employed when a conversation had just become genuinely interesting. "The legend, for instance. You will have heard it many times." Grigg was quiet for a moment. The sea moved. A gull passed overhead with mechanical indifference. "Heard it," he said at last. "Seen things that fitted it too. If a man were inclined to believe." His voice carried no invitation to inquire further on this point, which meant, in Poirot's experience, that the invitation was present, but required patience to accept. "I don't go in the cellar after dark," he added, as though this were a policy of such obvious good sense that it required no elaboration. "Since when?" Poirot asked. Grigg looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but contained elements of both. "Since a night 6 weeks ago when I found the door to it standing open and the latch cold in a way it doesn't get cold in summer." He turned back to the water. "Nothing there when I looked. Nothing I could put a name to. But I don't go in after dark." Poirot considered this. 6 weeks ago. He stored the date with the careful precision of a man who knew that dates, like chairs positioned at exact angles, were never without meaning. "One more question," he said. "At the 7th place. Who lays it?" "I do," said Grigg. "Every morning, every evening. 43 years. He paused. "Mrs. Ashcombe has never asked me to. Never told me to stop neither. Some things," he said with the philosophical finality of a man who has made peace with inexplicable obligations, "you just continue." The other guests appeared by degrees, assembling in the breakfast room with the varied energies of people who had slept with different degrees of success. Miss Tregoran arrived first, pale and careful, with the look of someone who had spent several hours listening to the dark and was not yet certain it had finished speaking. She took her tea without milk, held the cup in both hands, and said nothing for some time. When she did speak, it was to Poirot, and quietly, as though she did not wish to be heard making the admission. "I heard something last night," she said, "below my room, a dragging sound." "At what hour?" Poirot asked. "After 2. I couldn't say precisely." She looked at her tea. "I have heard it before, not recently. Years ago when I stayed here as a child. It was one of the things that—" She stopped. Her hands were quite still for once, arrested by the weight of what she was not saying. "That convinced you," Poirot supplied gently. She nodded without looking up. Hugh Ashcombe entered before she could continue, said good morning with the brisk efficiency of a man creating forward motion through cheerfulness, poured coffee, and sat down with a newspaper he showed no signs of actually reading. He was, Poirot thought, performing composure with rather more effort than the previous evening. There were shadows beneath his eyes and a tightness about his jaw that spoke of a night spent in conscious management of some anxiety. "Blowing up outside," Hugh said, not looking up from the unread newspaper. "So Mr. Grigg informs me," said Poirot. He suggests a considerable storm." "He's been suggesting considerable storms for 40 years, and he is occasionally correct." Hugh turned a page. "The causeway will flood by this afternoon if it worsens." We shall be cut off until morning at the earliest." He said it with the studied unconcern of a man who has decided in advance to find this unremarkable. Miss Tregoron made a small sound that was not quite a word. Mrs. Pike arrived next, composed and warm, bearing the quality she always seemed to carry of having just come from somewhere pleasant. She settled into her chair with comfortable authority, inquired after everyone's sleep with genuine seeming solicitude, and listened to the answers with the focused, almost hungry attention that Poirot had noticed the previous evening. She encouraged, she drew out. She remembered what people said and reflected it back to them in slightly improved form. She was, Poirot thought, I'm watching her pour tea for Miss Tregoron with the particular care one afforded to someone in a delicate state, extraordinarily good at making people feel understood. He found this, on reflection, more troubling than reassuring. Dr. Linton appeared last, loudly, with the unconvincing heartiness of a man who is committed to a position and intends to maintain it regardless of atmospheric evidence to the contrary. He dismissed the approaching storm, dismissed the conversation about the night's sounds. Old houses settle. It is a structural phenomenon. I have said so from the beginning. And dismissed, with a particularly vigorous wave of his butter knife, any suggestion that the events of the previous century had any bearing whatsoever upon the events of the present one. "You are very certain, Doctor," Poirot observed pleasantly. "I am a man of science," Linton said. Certainty is the natural condition." "Ah." Poirot accepted a piece of toast from the rack. "In my experience," he said, applying butter with the concentration of a man for whom all tasks deserve equal attention, certainty expressed at great volume is sometimes the symptom of a doubt expressed at none." Linton stared at him. Poirot smiled and ate his toast and said nothing further. Outside, the first real gust of wind struck the house broadside. The windows shook. The sea, in which had been flat and purposeful all morning, rose with a sudden decisiveness of something that had been waiting for permission. By noon, the causeway was gone. They were 8 people on an island, 7 guests and 1 old man who would not go into the cellar after dark, and the world had quietly sealed itself around them. At dinner that evening, the 7th place was laid as always, and when the lamp above the table guttered just once, in a draught from no direction anyone could identify, every head turned, quite involuntarily, toward the empty chair. It was still empty, for now. Chapter 3. Something Wakes. The storm did not announce itself further. It simply arrived in the manner of certain house guests who, having sent no warning, present themselves at full inconvenience and show no intention of leaving. By 4 o'clock, the windows of the upper floors were running with water. By 6, the generator was producing electricity in the irregular, effortful way of a mechanism asked to perform beyond its confidence. Lamps flickered. Conversations paused. People looked at ceilings as though expecting confirmation of something they had not yet decided to believe. Mrs. Ashcombe moved through all of it with the steady, unhurried competence of a woman who had weathered storms in this house before, and understood that the house always outlasted them. As she checked the window latches on the ground floor, she spoke to the kitchen about dinner. She brought additional candles to the drawing room and set them on the mantelpiece with the matter-of-fact air of someone performing a sensible precaution rather than a ritual. Though Poirot, watching, noted that she placed 7. He did not remark upon it. Instead, he sat near the fire with a small glass of brandy. Mediocre, but the cellar apparently ran to nothing better, and gave every appearance of being pleasantly idle, which was the appearance he found most productive. Hugh Ashcombe stood at the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the water. Miss Tregoran had taken up some needlework and was not doing it. Dr. Linton had produced a medical journal and was reading it with ostentatious absorption. Mrs. Pike sat beside Mrs. Ashcombe on the sofa and spoke to her in a low, continuous murmur. The words inaudible but the tone unmistakable. Soothing, sustaining, the voice one uses with someone whose composure is a thing that requires maintenance. "You have known Mrs. Ashcombe a long time," Poirot said to no one in particular, which was a technique that sometimes produced answers from unexpected directions. It was Hugh who answered without turning from the window. "Mrs. Pike came to Aunt Lydia after my uncle died. 12 years ago, perhaps. She has been here, or wherever Aunt Lydia has been, ever since." A pause. "She is indispensable, I suppose, is the word." "It is a fortunate thing," Poirot said pleasantly, "to be indispensable." "Or a carefully arranged one," said Hugh, and then seemed to hear what he had said, and added nothing further. Poirot looked at his brandy. Dinner was served at 7:30, slightly later than the previous evening, and owing to some unspecified difficulty in the kitchen that Thomas Grigg communicated via a single appearance at the dining-room door, a brief statement of the word delayed, and a withdrawal so complete as to suggest the matter was now entirely resolved. The table was laid as always. They sat, 6 of them, and the 7th chair stood empty and the wind pressed against the windows in long, sustained exhalations, and the conversation moved in the slightly artificial manner of people who are avoiding several subjects simultaneously. It was during the fish course that it happened. Miss Tregoran had been quieter than usual throughout the meal, her attention drifting, or appearing to drift, toward the foot of the table with a frequency that the others had begun, in various ways, to notice and elect not to acknowledge. Dr. Linton had twice redirected her with a question. Hugh had refilled her wineglass with the deliberate solicitude of a man creating distraction. Mrs. Ashcombe had not looked at her at all, which was its own form of attention. Then Miss Tregoran's fork descended to her plate with a small, precise click. "Someone is there," she said. Her voice was not loud, it did not tremble. It carried the particular quality of a statement made by a person who has stopped arguing with what they are seeing. Every head turned. The 7th chair was occupied. The figure seated in it was pale, extraordinarily pale, and still in a way that living bodies are not still, with the complete arrested quality of something that has never moved and does not intend to. The head was bowed. The hands folded upon the table's edge were the colour of old candle wax. There was no sound of breathing, no movement at all. The lamp above the table chose this moment to gutter severely. Dr. Linton was on his feet before anyone else spoke. "Nonsense," he said. "You with the force of a man who has staked a position and intends to defend it physically if necessary." He strode the length of the table, reached for the back of the 7th chair. It was empty. He stood with his hand on the chair back and looked at the vacant seat and then at the assembled company with an expression that moved rapidly through several states before settling, with visible effort, on contempt. "A trick of the light," he said. combined with an overactive collective imagination. I trust we can all agree to... From below them came a scream. It was Thomas Griggs' voice, unmistakably, horribly. And it came from the cellar. They found Dr. Marcus Linton at the bottom of the cellar stairs. He was on his back, which struck Poirot immediately as wrong. A man descending stairs who fell would not, in the normal course of physics, end on his back. His face held the fixed, wide expression of profound astonishment, and his lips had taken on a colour that Poirot recognised and did not like. There was no wound visible, no sign that he had struck the stairs or the walls with any force. He lay with a neatness that was almost compositional. Thomas Griggs stood 3 feet away with a lamp in his hand, his face the colour of the stone behind him, and said nothing at all. Poirot descended the stairs carefully, holding a candle, and crouched beside the body with the focused economy of a man for whom observation was a discipline. He noted the face, the hands, unclenched, relaxed, the position of the feet, the quality of the air in the cellar, which was cold and salt, and carried beneath those familiar notes something else, faint and sharp and briefly present, gone before he could hold it. He stood. He looked at the stair rail, the left side, then the right. He leaned close to the right-hand rail at approximately elbow height and remained there for 3 seconds. Then he straightened and turned to the gathered company on the stairs above him. Mrs. Ashcombe, white and rigid, Hugh gripping the wall, Miss Tregoran pressed against Hugh's shoulder with her eyes closed, Mrs. Pike standing 2 steps above the others with a candle held absolutely steady. "He is dead," Poirot said. "How?" Hugh's voice was controlled, but only just. "That," said Poirot, "is what we shall determine." He looked once more at the stair rail. "I would ask that no one touch anything in this room. Not the stairs, not the walls, not the door. And I would ask," he added, in a tone that made it something rather more than a request, "that everyone return upstairs and remain together." They went. Poirot did not immediately follow. He stood alone in the cellar for a further 2 minutes, candle in hand, so looking at nothing in particular with the concentrated attention of a man assembling something in his mind. The smell he had noted was gone entirely now. He could not be certain he had smelled it at all, but he was certain. The right-hand stair rail, at the height at which a descending person would naturally place their hand for balance, carried a faint, unmistakable trace of something waxy and sharp and entirely out of place among the salt and earth of a 200-year-old cellar. Theatrical grease paint. He filed the detail in the precise internal catalogue where he kept the things that mattered, beside the worn carpet beneath the 7th chair, and the date 6 weeks ago, when Grigg had found the cellar door open and the latch inexplicably cold. Then he went upstairs to sit with people who were frightened and to watch, with great care, which of them was not. The drawing-room that night had the quality of a vigil. Candles supplemented the uncertain electricity, but the storm continued its assault on the windows without apology. No one proposed going to bed. They sat in the arrangement of people who find proximity to others marginally preferable to solitude, and they did not, for the most part, speak. Miss Tregoran sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes at the middle distance, having passed through fear into something quieter and more durable. Mrs. Pike moved between the others with tea and small attentions, her face composed in an expression of gentle, vigilant concern. Poirot watched her and thought about the figure in the seventh chair, the bowed head, the folded hands, the absolute and practiced stillness. He thought about how Mrs. Pike had been the one to describe those precise details at dinner the previous evening. Hands folded, she had said, watching. He poured his tea, found it adequate, and permitted himself the smallest of private observations. Ghosts, in his experience, did not require a prior description. People who created them did. Chapter 4. In the dark, we show our true faces. Fear, Poirot had observed over the course of a long career, was an excellent chemist. It stripped away the compounds of social performance and left behind the elemental substance of a person, some reduced to generosity, some to selfishness, some to a peculiar, brittle lucidity. Some simply became more completely themselves, as though the removal of ordinary pretense had been, and all along, a relief. He spent the hours after midnight conducting what he privately termed his second investigation. Not of the cellar, not of the body, but of the drawing room and the people in it. Hugh Ashcombe drank steadily and quietly, not to the point of dissolution, but to the point of maintenance, refilling his glass at intervals that suggested a careful, habitual management of some interior pressure. He sat apart from the women and spoke when addressed, and volunteered nothing, though which was itself a form of information. At 1:30 he asked Poirot, with studied off-handedness, whether there was any possibility the death had been natural. A heart, perhaps, or a fall. "It is possible," Poirot said, "but you don't think so." "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that it is important, at present, to think as little as possible and observe a great deal." Hugh looked at him for a moment, then looked away. He was an irritating man, he said, with the confessional quality of someone offering a small truth to forestall a larger examination. Linton, loud, certain of himself, but he didn't deserve... He stopped, set his glass down. He recognized something, didn't he? Or knew something. That's why. What makes you say so? Because nothing else here makes any sense. Hugh's voice was even, but his jaw was not. The rest of us are family, or near enough. Lydia, Clara, me. We have obvious connections to this house, to the estate, and to the history. Linton was a physician from London. He had no stake in any of it. Unless... He stopped again. Poirot waited, but Hugh, having arrived at the edge of whatever he had been approaching, elected not to cross it. He retrieved his glass. The moment closed. Mrs. Ashcombe sat by the fire throughout the night, with the endurance of a woman accustomed to sitting with difficult things. She did not weep. She did not speak at length. Twice she asked Grigg, when he appeared briefly at the door, whether the storm showed any sign of moderating, and received twice the same answer, a slow, single movement of the head that managed to be both a denial and an apology, and received it both times without visible reaction. It was near 3 a.m. when Poirot settled into the chair beside her and said, without preamble, "Tell me about Dr. Linton, not as a guest, as a connection. Why was he here?" Mrs. Ashcombe was quiet for a moment when the fire shifted. "He was recommended to me by my solicitor," she said at last, 6 months ago, as a physician with an interest in historical medical matters. There were some old documents that had come to light. Parish records, a baptismal register, an inquest record from 1793. My solicitor thought a medical opinion might be useful in assessing certain of the physical details described. The inquest into the death at Greyhaven, Poirot said. The poisoning. She looked at him without surprise. She had, he thought, been expecting him to arrive here eventually. Yes, the disputed inheritance. I had always known, in the vague way one knows family history, that there had been a death. What I had not known, what the documents revealed, was that the matter had never been properly resolved. The wrong done then? She stopped, smoothed her skirt. My solicitor advised me to understand the full picture before making any decisions. And had Dr. Linton formed any conclusions from what he examined? He was due to share them this weekend. A pause. He had indicated in correspondence that he had found something of significance. He was not a man, she added, with the careful understatement of someone selecting words from a wider available vocabulary, who found it easy to be discreet about such things. Poirot nodded slowly. The picture was assembling itself in the orderly fashion he preferred, each piece finding its natural position. Linton had known something, or had been about to say something, or had, in the particular way of men who find discretion effortful, already said something to the wrong person. He thought about who had been in the room when Linton had spoken most freely. He thought about Mrs. Pike, always present, always listening, always gently encouraging the conversation forward. These documents, he said, where are they now? In the library, in the escritoire. Mrs. Ashcombe frowned slightly. At least, they were. The library was cold and smelled of mildew and old bindings. The escritoire stood against the far wall, its surface clear, its single small drawer closed. Poirot opened it with the care of a man who expects to find it empty, and is not surprised when he does. He stood for a moment, looking at the empty drawer. Then he examined the escritoire's surface, the faint rectangular impression in the dust where papers had lain, recently and at some weight. He noted the displacement. He noted that the dust had been disturbed not in the rough, hasty manner of someone acting under urgency, but with a deliberate, almost tidy carefulness. Someone had taken those papers with the particular care of a person who did not wish it known that they had been taken. He looked at the door of the library, which had no lock, and at the single window, which gave onto the central courtyard and could be observed from 3 separate rooms on the upper floor. He considered the hours during which the library might have been accessed without observation, and arrived at an interval of approximately 40 minutes in the late afternoon, between the time the guests had gone to dress for dinner and the time they had reassembled in the drawing-room. 40 minutes was, what he reflected, quite sufficient for a person who knew what they were looking for. He returned to the drawing-room to find that the composition had altered in his absence. Miss Tregoran was no longer in her chair. Mrs. Pike, inquiring after this with mild concern, was told by a brief, tight-voiced Hugh that Clara had gone to bed and had asked not to be disturbed. She ought not to be alone, Mrs. Pike said. Not tonight. She was quite insistent, said Hugh. Mrs. Pike received this with a small, gracious inclination of the head that conveyed both acceptance and a faint, residual worry, worn lightly as a scarf. She turned to Poirot with the expression of someone sharing a confidence. Clara is not robust, you understand. This sort of thing, she has always felt it more than others. As a child, she was the same, sensitive, open to impressions. "You have known her long?" Poirot asked. "Oh, some years now. Through Lydia, naturally." She smiled. "One becomes fond." "Indeed." Poirot regarded her with the benign, slightly unfocused expression that people reliably mistook for inattention. "You mentioned last evening that the figure, the witness, is described as sitting with hands folded. Is that detail recorded somewhere? In some written account of the legend?" Mrs. Pike considered this with the appearance of genuine recollection. "I believe I read it somewhere. An old account. Or perhaps Lydia told me. One absorbs these things over time, living in a house with a history." "Quite so," said Poirot. He let the subject go in the way of a man who has found what he came for and sees no reason to remain longer at the site of the discovery. He wished the room good night, took his candle, and went upstairs. In the corridor outside his room he paused, turned, and walked instead to the end of the passage, where a door he had previously noted, narrower than the others, or set flush with the panelling, stood with the particular inconspicuousness of something that did not wish to be examined. He tried the handle. Locked. He crouched and looked at the keyhole. There was no key on this side. He applied briefly the candle to the floor before the door, and observed, in the slight disturbance of the dust at the threshold, the marks of recent passage. Someone had been through this door within the last 24 hours. He straightened, and made note of the door's precise location relative to the dining room below, and went to bed. He slept considerably better than the previous night, which was the reliable effect, in his experience, of a mind that had stopped searching and begun to find. Chapter 5. The History Beneath the Legend. The storm broke some time before dawn and left behind it the particular silence of a world that has been thoroughly rearranged. The sea was still agitated, but no longer malevolent. But the windows had stopped shaking. The house, which had spent the night creaking and protesting under the wind's interrogation, settled into the quiet of a witness who has nothing more to add. Poirot was at the escritoire in the library by 7 o'clock. Not the empty one. He had noted the previous evening a second escritoire in the room's far corner, older than the first, its surface obscured by a geological accumulation of newspapers, correspondence, and the particular detritus of a house in which things were put down provisionally and never relocated. He worked through it with methodical patience, disturbing nothing permanently, replacing each layer as he examined it. In the third stratum, he found what he had suspected might be there. A bundle of documents tied with faded green ribbon, their paper darkened at the edges with the comfortable deterioration of genuine age. Parish records. A baptismal register with entries in 2 different hands, and beneath these, a folded sheet of heavier paper, its creases deep with repeated consultation. He read it twice standing at the escritoire with the early light coming grey and flat through the library window. Then he sat down. The document was an inquest record from the autumn of 1793. The death it recorded was that of one Miss Anne Vane, younger daughter of the late Colonel Vane of Greyhaven, who had died suddenly following a dinner at which the matter of her father's estate had been discussed among the family. The coroner's conclusion was inconclusive. Death by uncertain causes, a verdict that in 1793 covered a considerable range of possibilities and committed the court to none of them. But it was the testimony appended to the record that Poirot read most carefully. A servant, one Mary Croft. He had stated that among the guests present at the dinner, she had observed a young woman she did not recognize, pale, still seated at the table's end, whom she could not afterwards account for, and whom, upon inquiry, none of the other servants had admitted or served. The testimony had been recorded in full, and then, in a different ink and a different and considerably more authoritative hand, marked across its centre with a single word. Disregarded. Poirot set the document down, or he thought about a young woman sitting silent and unacknowledged at a table. He thought about the dead sister and the surviving one, and the estate that had passed, in the aftermath of that inconclusive inquest, entirely to the elder branch of the family. He thought about a story born in the immediate wake of an injustice which had persisted for 130 years, accreting detail and dread with each retelling. Then he went to find Thomas Grigg. He located him in the kitchen, which was the room in which Grigg spent the majority of his time when not performing his visible duties, and which had the quality of a command post, everything in it positioned for maximum utility, nothing wasted, the whole arrangement expressing a philosophy of existence that Poirot found, despite himself, rather admirable. He placed before Grigg the baptismal register, opened to a specific page, and said nothing. Grigg looked at it for a long time. His face performed no particular expression during this interval. Then he said, "Who else has seen this?" "I believe Mrs. Ashcombe's solicitor and Dr. Linton before his death." Poirot paused. "And whoever removed the other documents from the upstairs escritoire." Grigg's eyes came up at that. "The entry," Poirot said, indicating the relevant line. "A baptism recorded in January of 1794, 4 months after the inquest. The mother listed as Mary Croft, and the father's column left empty, in the child's given name, Anne. The servant who testified, she left Greyhaven within a week of the inquest, you told me, but not," he said, "before this." Grigg was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gull called. The sea moved with its restored, ordinary rhythm. "My grandmother knew the story," he said at last. "The family version, not the one they tell visitors." He looked at the register with the expression of a man regarding something he has been aware of for a long time, and has never previously been required to acknowledge aloud. There was a child. The servants, or said to be, left the county. The family sent money for a while, then stopped. He paused. My grandmother said the money stopped when the child was old enough to ask questions. And the child's descendants, Poirot said carefully, would have a claim. A suppressed one, an illegitimate one by the standards of the day, but a claim nonetheless, if the father could be established. A claim to Greyhaven, précisément. Grigg turned the register in his hands and then set it flat on the table with the deliberate finality of a man returning something to its correct position. 43 years I've worked in this house, he said. Never told anyone what my grandmother told me. Seemed like old trouble, or seemed like the sort of thing that stays buried for good reason. He looked up, but someone else knew. Someone else, Poirot agreed, knew rather more than old trouble. He found Miss Tregoran in the garden, or rather at its edge, where the formal arrangement of the grounds gave way to rough coastal grass, and the land dropped away toward the rocks and the now calming sea below. She was standing with her arms folded against the morning cold, her fair hair moving in the remnant wind. And she had the look of a woman who had come outside not for air, but for the particular clarity that distance from a house sometimes provides. She heard him approach and did not turn immediately. When she did, her face had the open, exhausted quality of someone who had spent the night arriving at a decision. "I want to tell you something," she said without preliminary. "I am listening, mademoiselle. Eleanor, Mrs. Pike, came to my room last night, or after I had retired." She said this with the careful precision of someone delivering evidence rather than complaint. She was very kind, very gentle. She sat with me for perhaps an hour, and she talked about the house, about the legend, about what I had seen at the table. A pause. She asked me, several times in different ways, what exactly I had seen, the precise details, what the figure was wearing, whether its face had been visible. She stopped. Let the sea fill the silence for a moment. At the time it seemed like sympathy. This morning it seemed like something else. "What did you tell her?" "That I had seen a pale figure, still, head bowed, hands folded on the table." She met his eyes. She seemed, satisfied is too strong a word, but she stopped asking after that. Poirot nodded slowly. The locked door above the dining room, the concealed observation slit he had not yet found, but whose existence the door's position made geometrically certain, in the prior description delivered at dinner with such fluent precision. And now, this, a woman carefully establishing the night before she intended to perform again the exact quality of what her audience had already seen. "Monsieur Poirot," Miss Tregarren said, "she was my friend. I have believed that for 3 years. "I know," he said with the gentle directness he employed in moments that did not benefit from softening. "It is often the case that the most painful element of a deception is not the deception itself, but the accurate friendship concealed within it." She looked at him with an expression he recognized, the compound of hurt and the beginning of anger, which was, in his view, a considerably more useful emotion than grief for the purpose of what came next. "What do we do?" she asked. Poirot straightened his coat. The morning air was cold and briny, and the sun was making a modest and unconvinced appearance on the horizon. "We do," he said, what has always been the correct response to a ghost story. He permitted himself a small, private smile. "We turn on the lights." He did not, of course, explain further. But as they walked back toward the house, he was already constructing in his mind the arrangement of the evening, the candles, the table, the 7 places, the particular angle of the mirror he had noticed on the dining room's east wall and had been thinking about, in the patient, lateral way of his best thinking, ever since. The mechanism was almost complete in his mind. One piece remained. He needed to find what was behind the locked door. The key to the narrow door, he reasoned, would not be kept far from the door itself. It would need to be accessible quickly and in darkness. He considered the corridor's geography, the small table at its end bearing a lamp, a vase of dried flowers, and a shallow drawer which he had, on his first evening exploration, opened and found to contain nothing but a stub of candle and a box of matches. He had not, he now reflected, looked beneath the vase. He went upstairs. Beneath the vase was a key. He unlocked the door and held his candle through the gap. The space beyond was narrow, barely a passage, running parallel to the corridor and, as he had anticipated, directly above the dining room. In its far wall, At precisely the right height for a standing person to observe below, a vertical slit had been cut in the old panelling, no wider than 2 fingers, angled slightly downward. Through it, the dining room table was visible in its entirety, including, positioned at its foot with a clear line of sight, the 7th chair. On the floor of the passage, set neatly against the wall, were 3 things: a folded garment of pale fabric, a small tin, and a dark bottle. He opened the tin. A white grease paint, pressed flat and smooth, recently used. He did not need to open the bottle. The smell reached him first, sharp, evaporating, chemical. Ether. He stood for a moment in the dark passage with his candle looking at the 3 objects and felt the satisfaction that was entirely his own and that he shared with no one. The satisfaction of a mind that has followed a true line to its true conclusion. Then he locked the door behind him, replaced the key beneath the vase, and went downstairs to consider the precise arrangement of the evening ahead. Chapter 6. 2 events, 1 hand. The morning distributed itself across Greyhaven with the reluctant generosity of weak winter sunshine, present enough to notice, insufficient to warm. The sea had settled into its ordinary grey indifference. The causeway remained submerged, though Grigg, having consulted the horizon with the authority of long experience, pronounced it passable by early afternoon, and no one appeared particularly eager to use it. This Poirot found instructive. A group of people cut off on an island by a storm, one of their number dead under circumstances that no one had yet formally named as suspicious. Such people ought, by the ordinary logic of self-preservation, to be crowding the causeway at the first available moment. Instead, they moved through the house with the careful, slightly dazed quality of individuals who have not yet decided what to do with what they know, and who find, in the absence of that decision, that remaining still is marginally preferable to moving. He used the morning deliberately. Hugh Ashcombe he found in the estate office, a small room off the entrance hall lined with ledgers and the accumulated administrative evidence of a property that had been managed, with varying degrees of attention, for 2 centuries. He was seated at the desk with papers before him that he was not reading, and he looked up when Poirot entered with the expression of a man who has been expecting an interruption and has mixed feelings about its arrival. "The causeway will be clear by 2, Hugh said. "So Grigg believes." Poirot settled into the chair opposite with the unhurried ease of a man entirely confident he would not be asked to leave. "You were going to say something last night," he said without further introduction. "About Dr. Linton, about why he had no stake in the family history. Are you stopped?" Hugh was quiet. He looked at the papers before him, which were, Poirot now saw, not estate correspondence but personal letters, older ones, their envelopes worn at the folds. "My aunt told me about the documents," Hugh said at last, "about what the solicitor had found. 3 months ago. She was distressed by it, more than she showed." He paused. "She has spent 40 years caring for this house, restoring it, keeping it. She has no children. She intended to leave it to me." He said this last without particular emphasis, the statement of a fact that carried its own weight without requiring elaboration. The thought that there might be a prior claim, a suppressed one hidden in parish records. He stopped. "She didn't sleep for a week." "And you?" Poirot asked. I told her it was 130 years old and that no court in England would entertain it. He looked up. I still believe that. Legally. A slight pause arrived, and carrying a qualification he did not quite voice. But Linton had found something in the medical testimony. Something about the manner of the first death, Anne Vane's death, that he said altered the picture, made the original verdict look engineered. He set the letters down. He told Aunt Lydia. He also told Mrs. Pike at dinner the first evening, before Aunt Lydia could ask him to be discreet. He seemed to consider it fascinating rather than sensitive. Hugh's mouth compressed briefly. He was not a man much troubled by other people's difficulties. Poirot said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about a physician from London invited to assess historical medical testimony, arriving at Greyhaven with conclusions that reframed a 130-year-old wrong. He was thinking about those conclusions communicated at dinner, in the open, in Mrs. Pike's immediate hearing. And he was thinking about the cellar stairs and the grease paint on the rail, and the ether in its dark bottle. The documents that were taken from the escritoire, he said. Linton's findings were among them. His written notes, yes. He had prepared a summary. Hugh's voice was even. Without those notes, his conclusions die with him. They become a dead man's unsubstantiated claims. He looked at Poirot directly. Whoever took them understood that. Poirot rose. "Thank you," he said. "You have been, if I may say so, considerably more useful than you intended." Hugh looked at him with an expression that was not quite offended and not quite amused. "Is that meant to be reassuring?" "It is meant," said Poirot pleasantly, "to be accurate." He encountered Mrs. Pike in the corridor outside the drawing-room at 11:30. She was carrying a tray, tea for Mrs. Ashcombe to judge by its contents. And she met Poirot with her habitual warmth, had the expression of a woman who has decided that the present situation calls for steady, practical kindness, and has accordingly provided it. She had been providing it, Poirot reflected, with remarkable consistency since the moment of Linton's death, perhaps before. "How is Mrs. Ashcombe this morning?" he asked. "Tired." Mrs. Pike's voice carried the soft, proprietary concern of a long-term companion. "Naturally. It has been a terrible night." She adjusted the tray. "She is resilient, however. In my experience of her, she always has been." 10 years is a considerable experience," Poirot said. 12, in fact, she smiled. "One loses count." She had said 10 the previous evening, in the drawing-room in response to Hugh's comment. Poirot had noted it then and noted it now, not as a significant discrepancy in itself, for people misremembered durations of comfortable arrangements readily enough, but as one thread among several that he had been keeping separate, I'm waiting to see whether they connected. "You must know the house very well," he said. "Every room." She said it with the ease of a statement that was both true and, in her view, entirely unremarkable. "Every corner. Lydia has always encouraged me to treat it as my own." A brief, fond pause. "I have, I confess, done so." "Every room," Poirot repeated pleasantly, "including, no doubt, the service corridor on the upper floor, the narrow one." Nothing shifted in her face. Nothing at all. It was, in its absolute stillness, more telling than any flinch. "One becomes familiar," she said after a moment. "Quite so." Poirot smiled and stepped aside to let her pass. "Please do give Mrs. Ashcombe my regards." He watched her continue down the corridor, the tray steady in her hands, her pace unchanged, and thought about a woman who had spent 12 years, not 10, making herself indispensable to the owner of a house to which she believed she had a prior and buried claim, to 12 years of patience, 12 years of presence, of listening and feeding fear and preparing the ground. The legend had not been difficult to revive. It had required only someone who knew which door to unlock. The second supernatural event came that afternoon. He had not expected it so soon, which was itself useful information. It suggested urgency, a timetable compressed by Linton's death, and the approaching accessibility of the causeway. The performance was running ahead of its intended schedule. They were assembled in the drawing room at 3 o'clock. All of them, even Mrs. Ashcombe, who had come downstairs with the careful movements of someone compensating for a poor night, when the bell sounded from below. One clear, deliberate note. They looked at one another. Grigg, who had entered with fresh wood for the fire, stopped with a log in each hand. "There is no bell," Hugh said. He said it flatly, and was a man correcting an error, though his face suggested he was less certain of this than his tone implied. Poirot was already at the door. "Shall we see?" They descended in a group, which was, he noted, what they had also done when Grigg had screamed, collectively, as though safety resided in number, which in this particular instance was a very reasonable assumption. The cellar door stood closed. The passage outside it was empty. The air held nothing unusual, except out on the floor before the cellar door, scratched into the old flagstone in letters that were careful and deliberate and recently made. 2 words. "I saw." Miss Tregoran made a sound that was not quite a word. Grigg set down his logs with a deliberateness that suggested he was concentrating very hard on a physical task in order to avoid addressing the alternative. Mrs. Ashcombe stared at the floor with the expression of a woman who has reached the outer boundary of what composure can manage. Mrs. Pike stood to one side, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Ashcombe's arm, her face composed in the particular expression she had worn since Linton's death. Sorrowful, concerned, steady, present. She looked at the letters in the stone. "It is exactly what they described," she said very quietly. "In the account of the first witness, I saw. Those were the words." Poirot crouched over the inscription. He produced from his breast pocket a small magnifying glass, its presence occasioning no comment, as the assembled company had other concerns, and examined the letters closely. Chalk, white chalk, pressed hard into the surface and partly rubbed away, as though the inscription had been made with effort and some haste. The particles were fine and modern and bore no resemblance to the composition of the flagstone beneath them. He looked up at the cellar door. He looked at the distance between the door and the wall. He looked at the ceiling above, and at the particular arrangement of the joists, and at the thin, almost invisible line where 2 flagstones met at an angle that was not quite consistent with the rest of the floor. He stood. He said nothing. He put away the magnifying glass. "Monsieur Poirot." Mrs. Ashcombe's voice was very controlled. "What does it mean?" "It means," he said, with the measured certainty of a man who has just confirmed the last piece of a construction he has been building in his mind for 2 days, "that we are very nearly at the end." He looked at the company assembled around him in the dim passage. Frightened faces and steady ones, grief and performance, the innocent and the not innocent, standing in the same circle of candlelight. "I would ask that everyone remain available this evening. I have an announcement to make at dinner." He paused. "At dinner," he repeated, with a slight, deliberate emphasis. "All 7 places will be laid." The silence that followed this remark had a different texture from any previous silence at Greyhaven. Only one person in the passage already knew what that meant, and that person said nothing at all. Chapter 7. The Ghost Unmasked. Dinner was set for 8 o'clock. Poirot spent the intervening hours in a manner that appeared, to those who observed him moving quietly through the house, to be the mild, purposeless wandering of a man at leisure. He examined the dining-room mirror, a tall pier glass in a gilded frame on the room's east wall, with the attentiveness of a connoisseur and the practicality of an engineer. He measured with his eye and then discreetly with the span of his hand the angle between the mirror and the service corridor door. He stood at the 7th chair and looked back toward the corridor's entry point, and then moved to various positions around the table and looked again. He spent 12 minutes in the cellar. He spent a further 20 in conversation with Grigg, who listened without interruption, and then produced, from a shelf in the outhouse that had not been examined by anyone else, a coil of electrical cable and a small portable generator that had been acquired 3 summers previously for a garden party and never returned to the shop from which it had been hired. "It functions?" Poirot asked. "Started it this morning," Grigg said, "out of habit." Poirot looked at him. "Seemed like the thing to do," Grigg said without further explanation. Poirot considered not for the first time that Thomas Grigg's 43 years at Greyhaven had produced in him a quality of practical prescience that was, in its own way, rather impressive. "Good," said Poirot. "We will need it tonight." He spoke to Miss Tregoran at 5 o'clock. She received his instructions with the composed attention of a woman who had moved, over the preceding 24 hours, from fear through anger to something cooler and more purposeful. She asked 2 questions. Both were good ones. He answered them honestly, which was his invariable practice with people who were owed the truth. And she nodded and went upstairs to dress for dinner with the expression of someone who has been given a task and intends to perform it adequately. He spoke to Hugh at 5:30. Hugh's response was briefer. He looked at Poirot for a long moment, asked one question. "Are you certain?" and accepted Poirot's answer with a stillness that was not doubt, but the temporary suspension of feeling that sometimes precedes action. Then he said, with a quietness that had nothing of his earlier careful composure about it, "She has been in this house for 12 years. "Yes," said Poirot. "Aunt Lydia considered her." "Yes," said Poirot again, gently. Hugh looked at the wall. "Right," he said at last. "Tell me what you need." He did not speak to Mrs. Ashcombe. She was resting, Grigg reported, and looked as though the resting was doing very little good. Poirot judged that what was owed to Mrs. Ashcombe, the full account, the explanation, the particular mercy of understanding, was owed to her in daylight, after sleep, might in the presence of people who could be of practical assistance. The evening's business was not hers to perform. She had, he thought, already performed enough. He did not speak to Mrs. Pike at all. There was nothing he needed from her that she had not already provided. They assembled at 10 minutes to 8. The dining room had been arranged precisely as it had been on the first evening. Grigg had laid the table with his habitual precision. 7 places, silver aligned, crystal present, the seventh chair at its accustomed remove, in its accustomed position, at the table's foot. The lamps were lit at their ordinary height, which was to say insufficient, the room settling into its familiar geography of warm pools and uncertain shadow. What had changed was invisible. Behind the dining room's service door, wedged between the door's frame and the wall at a height no casual observer would examine, ran a thin cable. It passed under the skirting with a neatness that Grigg had achieved with a chisel and 40 minutes' quiet work, through the passage wall and out to the outhouse where the generator sat fueled and ready. Beside the generator stood Hugh Ashcombe, who had asked for no further instruction beyond the single word that would constitute his cue. The cable connected at the dining room end to 3 electric bulbs of considerable combined candle power, all positioned with care above the table and currently dark. Poirot took his seat. The others followed. Mrs. Ashcombe, at Poirot's gentle insistence, had been persuaded to remain in her room with a tray. A request she had accepted with the lack of resistance of someone who understands, without being told, that their absence is a kindness to the proceedings. Miss Tregeron sat at Poirot's right, her hands in her lap, her face quite calm. Grigg stood at his customary position near the sideboard, here which tonight was not customary at all. Mrs. Pike came last. She entered with her usual warmth, apologised pleasantly for the slight delay, and took her seat with the easy movement of a woman entirely comfortable in the room and with the company. She accepted soup from Grigg's ladle with a small, grateful smile. She inquired in her gentle way after Mrs. Ashcombe's rest. Poirot watched her and thought, 12 years. The patience of it. The sustained, intelligent, daily performance of devoted friendship, maintained across 12 years of dinners and conversations and careful listenings. Whatever else Mrs. Eleanor Pike was, she was not a person of small resources. The first course passed in conversation that was, under the circumstances, remarkably ordinary. This was partly the effect of people trained by long social habit to produce normality on demand, and partly the effect of 2 people in the room performing normality for very different reasons. At the midpoint of the second course, Poirot set down his fork. "I have been thinking," he said in the pleasant, ruminative tone of a man sharing a thought of no particular urgency, "about the first evening, the figure at the 7th chair. I have been trying to recall the precise detail of it." He looked down the table toward the empty chair. The head bowed, the hands folded, the quality of the stillness. He paused. And the colour. It was very pale, a very specific pale. Not white, exactly, but the greyish white of... He appeared to search for a word. "Grease paint," said Miss Tregeron. She said it as they had rehearsed, simply clearly a woman reporting an accurate memory. She looked at Mrs. Pike with the particular candour of a person who has nothing to conceal. "I thought the same," she said. "Afterwards, when I was trying to recall it properly, I thought, I know that colour. It is the colour of theatrical makeup, the sort one uses for stage pallor." The soup ladle in Grigg's hand did not move. Mrs. Pike looked at Miss Tregeron. Her expression underwent nothing dramatic. The warmth remained, the steadiness remained. Only the very faintest alteration in the quality of her attention, a fractional increase in its focus, a slight rearrangement of what lay behind her eyes, indicated that the word had landed where it was intended. "An interesting observation," she said. "Is it not?" Poirot agreed. And it recalled to me another detail. There is a passage on the upper floor, a narrow service corridor running parallel to this room. I found it yesterday. It had been used recently. He looked at Mrs. Pike with the mild, direct attention he employed when he wished someone to understand that the time for a particular species of performance had concluded. It contained a folded garment, a tin of white grease paint, and a bottle of ether, which, when vaporized in an enclosed space, produces a cold considerably more convincing than the merely meteorological variety. The room was very still. Mrs. Pike set down her spoon. It made a small, precise sound against the bowl, and she looked at it for a moment as though considering something, and then looked up at Poirot with an expression that had shed every vestige of its social arrangement, and become, for the first time in Poirot's observation of her, entirely honest. It was not the face of a woman caught. It was the face of a woman who has reached the end of a very long road and finds, at its conclusion, a species of relief she had not anticipated. "The mirror," she said. "You worked out the mirror." "The angle was not difficult," Poirot said. "A figure positioned in the service doorway in pale costume, with phosphorescent paint applied to the fabric, aligned precisely with the mirror's reflective surface and the candlelight, visible from the table as an image without a source, present and impossible simultaneously." He paused. "It is, if I may say so, a genuinely ingenious construction." She received this without irony. "I spent 2 years designing it." "And the bell?" "A modified vent in the cellar wall, a metal tongue fitted to a sliding shutter. The wind did most of the work. I simply controlled when." "And Dr. Linton?" The room altered again. Something in Mrs. Pike's expression contracted slightly, not with guilt exactly, but with the weight of a thing that could not be undone. "He recognized the grease paint tin," she said. "He had seen it in my room 2 days before. He was not discreet about what he suspected. He said so at dinner, to me specifically, with that dreadful, laughing certainty of his. He said he would speak to Lydia in the morning." She stopped. I had ether in my pocket. The cellar was dark. He went down ahead of me. A long pause. "I did not plan it, which is perhaps the most truthful thing I can tell you." Poirot looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Now." The electric light came on. 3 bulbs of considerable combined candle power flooded the dining room with a clean, flat, modern brilliance that abolished every shadow simultaneously, and left Mrs. Eleanor Pike sitting at a dinner table in full illumination. Her pale costume folded over the back of the 7th chair where Grigg had placed it without her noticing, or the grease paint tin beside it, the dark bottle beside that. No shadows left. She looked at the costume for a long moment. Then she looked at Poirot. "I am the great-great-granddaughter of Mary Croft," she said. "She sat in this room and told the truth, and was marked disregarded and turned out within a week." Her voice was steady and without drama. "I have a document in my room, my great-grandmother's testament, written in her own hand. Not a legal claim, a true account." She paused. "I wanted Lydia to know. I wanted the house to know. I wanted it not to have been buried for another 100 years. "That," said Poirot after a moment, "I believe entirely." He rose from his chair. Outside, through the dining room window, the sea moved in its patient, perpetual way against the rocks below, and the lights of the mainland were visible on the horizon for the first time in 2 days. "The police," he said, "will arrive in the morning." Mrs. Pike nodded. She looked neither broken nor defiant, but like a woman who has been carrying something for a very long time and has set it down at last, regardless of consequence. She folded her hands on the table and sat perfectly still. Chapter 8, Daylight, Kills All Ghosts. The police arrived at 9:30 the following morning. There were 2 of them, a Detective Inspector Farrow from the Dorset Constabulary, a lean, methodical man with the unhurried efficiency of someone accustomed to islands and their complications, and a younger sergeant whose name Poirot did not immediately retain and whose primary function appeared to be the accurate recording of things his superior said. They came across the causeway in a motor car that was left, necessarily, on the mainland, completing the final passage on foot with their trouser hems darkened by the last of the tide. Greyhaven received them as it received everything, without particular adjustment. Poirot met them in the entrance hall and spent 20 minutes with Inspector Farrow in the estate office, during which time he presented, in the precise and economical manner that he had long ago determined was most effective with English policemen, the complete sequence of events from his arrival to the previous evening's conclusion. He placed before Farrow the grease paint tin, the ether bottle, the folded costume, and the chalk he had extracted from the flagstone inscription with a penknife and transferred to a small envelope. He indicated, on a sketch he had made that morning before breakfast, the location of the service corridor, the observation slit, the modified cellar vent. Farrow listened without interrupting. He examined each object with the careful attention of a man who will be required, at some point, to explain it to other men less patient than himself, and then he looked at the sketch. "The generator and cabling," he said. "That was yours?" "A precaution," Poirot said. "The darkness was her instrument. It seemed appropriate to remove it." Farrow looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite approval, but contained some of its elements. "And the documents she took from the escritoire?" "In her room. She made no attempt to conceal them, which I found, on reflection, characteristic. She wished the documents to exist. She wished the historical record to be corrected. Concealing them permanently would have defeated one of her primary purposes." Her primary purpose being? Poirot considered this with the care it deserved. "Recognition," he said at last, "of a genuine wrong. The murder of Dr. Linton was not her primary purpose. It was the catastrophic consequence of a plan that had not, until he recognized the grease paint tin, required one. She had spent 12 years and considerable ingenuity constructing a situation in which the truth of 1793 would be forced into the light. The legend was her mechanism. The haunting was her argument. He paused. "It is not a defense, but it is, I think, an accurate account." Farrow wrote something in his notebook, capped his pen, and stood. "I'll need to speak with her." "She is in the drawing room," Poirot said. "She has been there since 7 o'clock. Well, she declined breakfast, but accepted tea." He hesitated, then added, for accuracy, since accuracy was in all circumstances preferable to selective omission, "She has been entirely composed." He did not say that he found this in its way the most comprehensible thing about her. Mrs. Ashcombe was told at 10 o'clock. Poirot sat with her in the small morning room at the house's eastern end, where the light came in clean and flat off the water, and there were no shadows worth mentioning, and the sea was visible in its entirety from the window. Broad, ordinary, stripped of all nocturnal menace by the simple mechanism of the sun. He told her everything in the order in which he had discovered it, omitting nothing of significance and adding nothing that was not true. She listened without interruption. Her hands were folded in her lap, a coincidence of posture that Poirot noted and set aside. And her face held the particular stillness of a person receiving information that is, in the most essential sense, not a surprise, but whose full dimensions exceed what they had allowed themselves to imagine. When he had finished, she was quiet for some time. 12 years, she said at last. Yes. She sat at my table. A pause. She knew my fears. She was present when Edgar died, and when the roof required rebuilding. When Hugh's father... She stopped. The sentence had arrived somewhere she had not intended. She was present, she said simply, for everything. I know, said Poirot, and she used it. She used it, he agreed, and she also, I think this is true, though I offer it carefully, she also meant it. The friendship was real, in the way that things can be simultaneously real and instrumental. And the two are not always mutually exclusive. He said this not as consolation, which would have been an impertinence, but as the honest observation it was. It does not repair the harm, but it is the accurate picture. Mrs. Ashcombe looked at the sea for a long moment. The documents, she said, her great-grandmother's testament, the 1793 inquest record, the baptismal register. She turned to look at Poirot with the clear, yet steady gaze of a woman who has decided something while appearing merely to think. They will be retained as evidence, I suppose. For the trial, yes. And afterwards? Poirot met her gaze. He had, over the course of a long career, learned to recognize the questions that were not questions, but statements awaiting confirmation. That, he said, will be a matter for your solicitor, and for your own judgment, and for no one else. Something in her face shifted. A very slight, very private movement, the expression of a person who has received, unexpectedly, a small measure of the thing they needed most. She nodded once and returned her gaze to the window. Miss Tregoran found Poirot in the garden at 11, or rather at its coastal edge, where he stood with his coat buttoned against the November air and looked at the water with the expression of a man engaged in a private accounting. She has gone, Miss Tregoran said. With the inspector? Yes. She stood beside him. The sea moved. A gannet dropped from a considerable height into the water with the purposeful efficiency of a creature that has identified its objective and sees no reason for ceremony. They watched it resurface. I keep thinking about the child, Miss Tregoran said. The servant's daughter. Anne, she was christened. The same name as the woman who died. She paused. It seems a very particular kind of grief, to name a child after a wrong. Or a very particular kind of resolve, Poirot said. She considered this. Mrs. Pike, Eleanor Marsh, I suppose I must call her now, she never asked for the house. Did you understand that? From what she said last evening. She did not want possession. She wanted acknowledgement. I understood it perfectly. He looked at the water. It is the more human motive, in my experience. Property can be satisfied by law. The need to be seen, to have one's existence and one's injury confirmed by the world, that is considerably less tractable. A pause. It is also, when frustrated long enough, considerably more dangerous. Miss Tregoran was quiet for a moment. "And Marcus Linton," she said. His name, unadorned, carried a weight it had not carried when he was alive and speaking loudly at dinner. He was an irritating man. He was indiscreet and self-satisfied, and he could not have cared less about the feelings of anyone in that house. She stopped. He did not deserve what happened to him. No, Poirot said. He did not. It was, he felt, the sum of what could honestly be said on the matter. Hugh Ashcombe drove him to the causeway at 2:00. They crossed in silence for the most part, Hugh's hands steady on the wheel of the borrowed car, in the island receding behind them in the mirror, as the mainland track rose and solidified under the tyres. The sea on either side of the causeway was pewter and calm. At the mainland road, Hugh stopped the car and said, without looking at Poirot, "The testament, Mary Croft's document, her account of what happened in 1793. He was quiet for a moment. If it corroborates Linton's findings, if the original death was what he believed it to be, then the family's title to Greyhaven is built on something that cannot be cleanly defended. That, Poirot said, is an accurate legal observation. My aunt has already spoken to her solicitor this morning." Hugh paused. "She intends to establish a trust, a formal acknowledgement in the house's records, a memorial of some kind." He stopped again in the manner of a man editing as he speaks. She said it was overdue by approximately 130 years. Poirot looked at him. Hugh Ashcombe had the expression of a man who had come by a difficult route to a position he had not anticipated occupying, and found it, on balance, the right one. "Your aunt," Poirot said, "is a woman of considerable moral clarity." "She is," Hugh agreed. "Always has been. I simply hadn't tested it before." He offered his hand. Poirot shook it. The motor car that would carry Poirot to the station was waiting on the verge, its engine running, its driver reading a newspaper with the comfortable patience of a man who has been told to wait and has every confidence he will eventually be required. Poirot's luggage, 2 cases, impeccably strapped, was already in the boot. He did not look back at the island. He was not, in general, a man who found sentiment in landscape. But he permitted himself, and as the car moved onto the main road and the sea fell behind the rise of the hill, one private observation. The 7th place would still be laid, he thought. Not out of superstition, not out of fear, but out of something rather more durable than either. It seemed, on the whole, the correct decision. He was back in his London flat by 6:00. George had anticipated his return, as George invariably did by some mechanism Poirot had long since ceased to interrogate. And there was coffee, hot and perfect, and the rooms were warm, and the mantelpiece ornaments stood in their habitual symmetrical arrangement, and the chair by the fire was precisely as he had left it. He sat. He drank his coffee. He looked at the mantelpiece where a small pair of figurines stood at their exact and customary distance from one another, and after a moment he rose and adjusted the right-hand one by perhaps 3 millimeters, which returned it to its true position from which it had at some point during his absence imperceptibly migrated. He sat again. The room was orderly. The coffee was excellent. The chair was dry. He thought about the sound he had heard on that first night at Greyhaven, the slow drag across the floorboards, the single movement, the stillness that followed. He had found the mechanism for everything else. The bell, the cold, the figure at the seventh chair, the chalk inscription. All explained, all accounted for. Not that. He thought about it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he picked up his coffee cup and directed his attention with the decisive authority of a man who has earned his equanimity to the evening paper. Some questions, he reflected, were entitled to their privacy.